So, how can you define a video game? It often happens that you know the essence of a thing, but you are unable to define it because of how subjective our experience is with video games. Their definition as a medium keeps on shifting. However, an easier way of defining video games would be to identify their components, and by default, the presence of those components make a game what it is. Basically, games can be regarded as a fun cycle of challenge and reward across different levels, whether in terms of the narrative, gameplay, or exploration. And the critical value of a game is usually tied to how well such a cycle was implemented across the experience and for how long. Speaking exclusively of narrative games, throughout the playthrough, you're trying to pick the choices based on the outcome you wish to achieve by the end. If you are aiming for a fully evil playthrough and end up with a good ending, you automatically label that as a loss, and vice versa. Even some of the walk-in simulators out there, at least the narrative outcome is achieved by the end. Now, what happens when a game is ridden of the cycle of challenge and reward, along with a narrative that on the surface seems pointless? A game that sold more than 500,000 copies within a month of its release, over 1 million copies by the end of its first year, and 2.5 million copies across all platforms as of 2018. Yep, it's time to talk about Firewatch again. Please be informed that this video will contain heavy spoilers. I know that Firewatch was released like a decade ago, but you have to understand that this game can only be played once. So if you do intend to play it, this video is definitely not for you. Based on concept art from graphic artist Ali Moss, Firewatch was published as a joint venture by Campo Santo and Panic Inc. They took inspiration from actual national parks and established contact with actual fire lookouts, even reading Fire Season by Philip Connors. And what they found out is that this job is incredibly boring. So the project could not have been pitched as a Firewatch simulator, and the game took a narrative direction instead, taking inspiration from The Walking Dead, as the leads of the project, Jake Rodkin and Sean Veneman, have previously worked as creative leads behind it. But usually when that is brought into the conversation, you think of a wild cast of characters, extensive action, or crippling twists. Well, no. The game has less of those, as the only animate characters you get to see are the protagonist and the helicopter guy by the very end. The others are either heard or seen from a distance so far that you would not be able to know what they look like. You play as Henry, a middle-aged man working as a fire lookout for the duration of a summer, leaving behind a sick wife with her parents in Australia. He constantly reports to Delilah, with whom dialogue options will allow you to develop a certain form of attachment, as you both try to untangle a mystery that ends with a large fire in the Wyoming wilderness, and with your heart broken. Now, we've already established that this game lacks integral game components and is more like an experience. You basically don't die or lose. You do not develop any kind of skills or overcome outstanding challenges. Even by the end of the narrative, Henry as a protagonist doesn't achieve anything, and whatever he does won't change the eventual outcome of Delilah's departure or the spread of the fire. Well, there's a little bit more to it than that. Think of elements within the game, whether we're talking about the ending, the items you find and inspect, the characters you hear or talk to, Delilah, or even Henry himself. These elements, when taken separately on their own without association, mean nothing. What is the point in leaving garbage or cleaning it? What's the point of the dialogue options with Delilah if there is no practical outcome by the end except for conversation variations? Or even on Henry himself. During the final hike of the story, I was actually scared that some of my choices would result in leaving Henry behind to burn in the fire. We know now that none of this comes to pass. However, such elements were experienced differently. The game does a wonderful job of welcoming the player into its world. Henry as a protagonist is as relatable as any fictional character can get. He moves slow, he is scared, and he is morally flawed. His skills do not evolve much throughout the story as a fire lookout, and the developers intentionally kept the platforming mechanics simple and guided, because otherwise making them complex would ruin the character that they're trying to build. And Henry does something we all do, escaping from his problems, whether by reading conspiracy fiction, believing in conspiracy theories, or by leaving his sick wife behind and disappearing for 79 days. Possibly more, because we don't have concrete answer whether Henry actually went back to Julia or ran away again. Such relatability even started during the prologue. I've talked in my last video about how prologues aim to hook us into the narrative experience. Campo Santo puts you in the shoes of Henry from the very first sentence, with background canvas that transition from lightweight and merry to heavy and dark, mirroring how Henry's life was falling apart. It was also interesting because the developers didn't want you to learn about Henry's character through in-game conversations, and instead let you decide some of that across integral moments from his life in the span of a few minutes. As you reach the lookout and gaze at the spreading wilderness, you will come to realize how alone you truly are. Do you know the feeling when you finish the main story of an open world game? It feels like all the characters have moved on. You'd be so willing to establish contact with anyone because the world feels so empty, to the point that if you encounter even a reference of an NPC from the main story, you'd feel happy. I know I do. Firewatch capitalizes on such a sense of loneliness with its world, with a very calm soundtrack in the background, only with a few spikes during specific moments in the game. The world communicates with you through the traces of human presence that you can find across the wilderness. From the garbage, to the letters, to the fences, to Brian and Ned Goodwin. As a host of a cluster of intersecting stories, the world delivers it to you as it had witnessed it, without trying to affect your perception of it. Neutral and unbiased, your perceptions would be influenced once you actually encounter the human presence within the wilderness. Their effect on you will grow because it is unlikely that you're going to contradict them, given your current state of isolation. Enter Delilah. Much like Henry, maybe even more, Delilah is heavily flawed. She's there every step of the way as you talk with her through the radio. The conversation can branch off to different ends according to your dialogue options, even though the core events remain the same. The developers mentioned that you can learn more about her if you tell her less about yourself, which is twisted and weird, but very common and not as strange as you think. Their relationship gets a little too personal later. You see, it wasn't Henry who was attached to Delilah, but you were. Delilah is basically your dispatcher. Without her, you don't have a main purpose, and the game would slowly turn into an actual Firewatch simulator, which definitely wasn't the point. Delilah makes your experience less lonely. Also, the things she discloses to you or hides from you create an atmosphere of mystery around her. And the hate the ending got at the time didn't stem from a disappointment with the story, because that certainly wasn't the case. The disappointment was because the player didn't get to see Delilah. Through our conversations with her, we would automatically start to imagine what she would look like, how she would talk or react, how she would be able to express her emotions. Meeting her helps confirm or refute those assumptions, and at least it will give you closure and prepare you for the conclusion of the experience, like an actual narrative game. However, you are now back to being alone again, and more than that, you are faced with the obligation of going back and facing your problems. Even the wilderness is not as beautiful anymore. You can no longer perceive such a beauty with all the smoke and heat going around. Sure, you can leave the helicopter guy hanging and sit on the lookout, reflecting on the journey and Delilah, but eventually you choose to go home as the credits need to roll, and you can't be stuck there forever. The game's take on escapism is actually pretty horrific. A fire left unwatched will grow to eat everything. Ned Goodwin ran away from his problems, unable to face the reality of his son's death, and it eventually made things a lot worse. If you remain hung up on Delilah, then you would be left with the heartbreak of losing her, and with Henry's life and marriage falling apart, the situation begs for action. That the point is not to be a hero of a conspiracy, but the point is whatever you decide. The game's purpose is defined by you. What the game did was create an atmosphere where you can be attached, thrilled, and later detached. What you make of it is heavily reliant on your perception of the experience, which is as close to real life as it can get. I know that the point of a game is not to mirror real life, but to provide an escape from it. And Firewatch does nothing but remind you of that, at least in its own twisted way. Thanks again for sticking to the end of the video. I really hope you enjoyed it. How was your experience with Firewatch? What's your take on the ending? Make sure to tell me all about it in the comments below. And also make sure to press like and subscribe for more content. I'll see you in the next one.